this is where it becomes really important. I should say about what happens to the social housing, the new dwellings that are procured through social housing. This isn't a done deal, but our understanding is that all of it would be intended to come to community housing. That's ultimately come to, and we'll come to how it's procured, who does that, but ultimately it should all come across to community housing management with title. The Commonwealth was pushing for a benchmark of around 75% of whatever happens, so they're driving that, but Housing New South Wales, the Minister and Mike, their target is for the whole lot to come across. So that's kind of significant. Yeah, it's kind of significant. But it does throw up some very important challenges that I'll be coming to, and I absolutely need your instructions about how to advocate on behalf of those. The other thing I should say is that their starting position was, because of that incredibly short time frame and the very large amount of expenditure, and basically if they don't meet the deadlines that they've said to the Commonwealth they'll meet, they'll lose the money. And the state doesn't want to do that. So their starting point was, or Mike's starting point was, I'm responsible for making this happen, so I will drive the entire process. And in talking about driving the entire process, he had in mind that the whole tendering process or the whole procurement process would be managed centrally by Housing New South Wales. And I need your advice about what you think about that. But what I said to him was that in one sense, if we end up with the assets, that's not such a bad thing. But it would be a terrible pity if two things happened, well, three things really. If we had the only investment that we know of in the sort of going forward, and in fact the largest investment that's ever been made in this sort of time frame in social housing, and none of it was available to be used by housing providers to, if you like, build their relationships, undertake some of their own development. If none of it was available to build that capacity and those relationships, then that would be a terrible waste. Secondly, I know that there are a number of you who are already, for other things, like the social housing growth funds, like NRAS, already negotiating with developers, and it would be a pretty bad outcome if a centrally driven tendering process swept in over the top, pushed the prices up and made all of those negotiations fall over. And thirdly, if the assets are coming across to your ownership, if the whole procurement was done by someone else without your input. So I reckon there's at least 3 levels at which I was saying to him and to the Minister, we should be doing something more. I should also say that one of the expectations that the state has signed up to is that the investment will be leveraged to some extent. And Housing New South Wales can't do that. So unless they put some of it, at least, through the sector, they can't leverage it. Okay, so it's going to be centrally driven. What they were proposing was to pull in a lot of resources, so they would get the big 4 accounting firms to help them with the tendering process. They would get Department of Commerce assessment panels to help them with the assessment for the tenders, and they would certainly be drawing in as many of the major project management firms to help them do the procurement where they're doing development. So they were thinking of doing this central thing, and I'll come back to getting your advice about what we can say our sector wants to be involved in. While this is the biggest bucket of money that's ever come into social housing, it's not the only thing that's going on for you. And it's important, I think, just to put it in that context. Again, you will be very familiar with this, but it's worth saying this. that what we've got is, after all, NRAS, and this would be, I should say, those numbers are if you've got a per capita of the Commonwealth's target, and it all came to community housing. Now, we probably won't get per capita, the Commonwealth won't meet its target, and it won't all be done by community housing, but it gives us a bit of a sense of the overall scope of things. So, over 3,000 properties in the establishment phase, but close to 12,000 in the expansion phase. That's the Commonwealth's target, and that would be our per capita share. So that's starting to look like quite a lot. Remember that the sector is around 18,000 properties at the moment, and on my count that's 15,000 just in that lot. So that's pretty big. We've got the social housing growth funds around 1,600. We've got the stimulus package, and this is running a little bit ahead of what I was going to say, but the state's target is actually more than their per capita because they're bringing forward some of their own additional projects, and they're looking at doing about 9,000. So that's another 9,000. And there's also the accelerated stock transfer, which you have all heard about. I just put up a few thousand over the next year. The number is 3,000, but since it's not signed off, we're not going to say that, but that's the number. And I think most people in the room probably know. And that could be 3,000 year on year. Just start adding that up and look at the growth that we're looking at in the sector. So your appetite for the stimulus money needs to be put in the context of everything else that's going on. So I'm going to stop talking in a minute, but I do think that we really do have to get that kind of picture. The last thing that I wanted to say is very briefly about how the state imagines it's going to do its 9,000. And this is obviously subject to some change, but broadly speaking, they're expecting to purchase around 4,000 off the plan. So they'll be calling for expressions of interest from the development industry. Now this is critical because we know that a number of you are also seeking to purchase off the plan for development for things like the growth funds and for NRAS. So 4,000 coming from the state government could have a big impact on some of those negotiations. They want a spot purchase around 500, mainly so that they've got properties that they can use to decant for when they're doing estate reconfiguration. And that's 4.5, and the other 4.5 roughly they expect to do in terms of the bring forward of projects, really projects that they've got DAs or DAs in the pipeline, and now of course they don't have to worry about that because they can approve their own DAs. But bring about 4,500 of those will be their own development or redevelopment sites. So on sites that they own at the moment. Now, what role we play in that is an important question again, I guess. But it's an awful lot for them to be planning to do, 4,500. So that's broadly the shape of what's happening.